Have you ever seen a ghost worth £200 million? It stands right now in the centre of the English county of Buckinghamshire. Not ruins, not a medieval fortress, but a colossal palace whose windows are boarded up, and the great halls where the fate of the British Empire was once decided now serve as home only to dampness and dust. This place is called Mentmore Towers, and if you come closer, through the silence you might hear the echo of the loudest party of the Victorian era, which ended with the most shameful betrayal in the history of British culture. How could it happen that a house built by the richest dynasty on the planet, the Rothschilds, today stands abandoned, like an unwanted toy? Why did the UK government voluntarily allow the destruction of a collection that was called the Louvre in private hands? This story is not about bricks and gold. It is the anatomy of a fall. A story about how one man's ambition to build paradise on earth clashed with the cold bureaucracy of another century. And at the center of this drama is not a king or a commander, but a man named Baron Mayer. In 1850, Baron Mayer Amschel de Rothschild was perhaps the strangest representative of his legendary family. While his cousins and brothers managed banks, financed wars, and built railways, Mayer saw the world differently. He was the youngest son, the extra heir. He was not interested in the dry figures in the ledgers of London's city. What interested him was beauty and speed. Imagine a man with a soft gaze who felt more confident in the saddle of a racehorse than in a banker's chair. He was an outsider within the world's most powerful family. He didn't need to earn money. They were already his in quantities that are hard to comprehend. He needed something else. Mayer wanted to create something that would make the stuffy English aristocracy, who looked down on his Jewish surname, fall silent in admiration. He conceived not just a house, he conceived a manifesto. Most aristocrats of that time lived in cold old ancestral castles where drafts wandered the corridors for centuries. Mayer de Rothschild decided that his palace would be different. He wanted to combine the grandeur of the past with technologies of the future that no one even dreamed of. But for this impossible project, he needed a man who also did not recognize the word impossible. And here begins the first paradox of our story. Whom does England's richest man hire to build his Versailles? A famous architect from the Royal Academy? No, he hires a gardener. The man's name was Joseph Paxton. Yes, formally he was already known as the creator of the legendary Crystal Palace, but in his soul he remained a man who built greenhouses. And it was precisely this mad decision to entrust stone and gold to a master of glass and light that laid the foundation for one of Europe's most astonishing buildings. No one knew then that this very innovation, a glass roof piercing the heart of the house, would become a metaphor for the entire life of this estate. Transparency, brilliance, fragility. It seemed impossible that such beauty could ever disappear. But the clocks had already begun to tick, although none of those present at the laying of the first stone heard it. To understand the tragedy that would unfold 120 years later, one must return to the origins. Mayer Amschel de Rothschild was born in 1818 in a world where the surname Rothschild already meant power surpassing that of many monarchs. But in Victorian England, there existed a currency that could not be converted into pounds sterling. Origin. For the English landed aristocracy, whose ancestors arrived on the island still with William the Conqueror, the Rothschilds remained outsiders. They were too rich, too influential, and critically for that time, they were Jews. Mayer grew up with a clear understanding of the invisible wall. He was accepted in salons, people borrowed money from him, but he was never considered one of their own. Most people in his place would have chosen the path of assimilation, or conversely, seclusion. Mayer chose a third path. He decided to create his own world that would eclipse the old order. His philosophy was a mixture of hedonism and cold calculation. Unlike his father, Nathan, who was a financial genius and workaholic, Mayer positioned himself as a gentleman amateur. He understood that the path to the heart of English high society lay through two things: art and hunting. This was his first great strategy. He did not build a bank. He began to build a stage. In 1850, he begins buying up land in Buckinghamshire County. The choice of location was not random. It was a precise sniper shot. The land was in the very heart of England's best hunting grounds, just 40 miles from London. Mayer knew that if he created here a base for fox hunting, the elite's main entertainment, aristocrats would come to him themselves. And not just come, but fight for an invitation. Thus was born the concept of Rothschildshire. Mayer and his relatives began methodically buying up estates in the same area, turning rural Buckinghamshire into an enclave of unprecedented luxury. But Mayer was not satisfied with just buying land. He needed a building that would be a slap to public taste, in a good sense. Old English houses were dark, cold, and uncomfortable. They smelled of dampness and dogs. Mayer wanted a house that would smell of perfume, gold, and the future. Here his character manifested, a dreamer who thinks like an engineer. He rejected traditional Gothic, which the Victorians adored. The gloominess of the Middle Ages repelled him. He looked toward the Renaissance. His inspiration was sunlit Italian palazzos and French chateaux. He wanted to bring the light of the South to rainy England. This is why the choice fell on Joseph Paxton. The aristocrats laughed. Rothschild hired a gardener to build a palace. But Mayer saw what they did not. Paxton, who built the Crystal Palace from glass and iron, knew how to manage light and space like no classical architect. Mayer gave him carte blanche and a budget that today would be equivalent to tens of millions of pounds. This was the beginning of a style that art historians would later call Le Goût Rothschild, the taste of the Rothschilds. It was excess elevated to the absolute. If gold, then plenty. If velvet, then raspberry. If furniture, then that which belonged to French kings. Mayer was creating not just a cozy nest, he was creating a showcase. Every vase, every painting, every fireplace was to scream that the Rothschilds were not just equal to the aristocracy, they had surpassed it. But behind all this brilliance hid a deep social conflict. Mayer built this house as a fortress for his family, a place where they could be themselves without looking back at the whispers behind their backs. He created an illusion of eternity. It seemed to him that if the walls were built thick enough and the collection gathered grand enough, his legacy would be protected from any winds of history. He was wrong. He did not account for the main threat coming not from outside, but from within the very system he so aspired to integrate into. By the time construction began in 1852, Mayer already had the land, the money, and the plan. But he lacked the main element that would turn this house from a museum into a dynastic center. He needed an heir. Or, as fate decreed, an heiress whose life would become the key to the rise and fall of Mentmore Towers. In 1874, Mayer de Rothschild's great design collided with an insurmountable obstacle: death. The creator of Mentmore passed away, leaving behind a colossal fortune and one single daughter, Hannah. At her 23 years, she became Europe's richest bride. Newspapers called her fortune incalculable, but envious whisperers murmured that no millions could erase the stigma of outsiders from her surname. Mentmore Towers stood frozen. It seemed that the huge house, deprived of its master, would turn into a golden cage for the lonely heiress. But it is precisely here that the story makes a sharp turn. The second key character enters the stage, whose appearance will forever change the fate of this house: Archibald Primrose, 5th Earl of Rosebery. If the Rothschilds were the symbol of new, bold financial power, then Rosebery was the embodiment of old, arrogant Britain. He was 28 years old, brilliantly educated, handsome, incredibly ambitious, but at the same time known for his complex, melancholic character. There exists a famous historical legend that even at Eton, Archibald set 3 goals for himself: to marry England's richest heiress, to win the Derby, the main horse race, and to become Prime Minister. Many considered this a joke. No one suspected that he would fulfill every point of this plan. The meeting of Hannah and Archibald was not a romantic fairy tale in the usual sense. It was a collision of 2 galaxies. For Archibald, marriage to a Rothschild was a challenge. His own aristocrat friends dissuaded him from a union with a Jewish family, considering it a misalliance. For Hannah, this marriage was the final pass to the closed club of the ruling elite, where even her father's money could not buy an entry ticket. Their wedding in 1878 became the main social event of the decade. The Prince of Wales himself, future King Edward VII, attended the ceremony, which became a public signal. The Rothschilds are accepted. At that moment, Mentmore Towers ceased to be just a rich house. It transformed into the political center of the British Empire. It was this union, the old aristocracy and new capital, that found its perfect reflection in the architecture of Mentmore itself. The house was the physical embodiment of their marriage even before they met. On the outside, it was a building paying tribute to English tradition. Towers, stone carving, a silhouette reminiscent of Elizabethan estates of the 16th century. This was Archibald's world. But inside hid the world of the Rothschilds, a world of progress and innovation that shocked the unprepared guest. When carriages approached the grand entrance, visitors expected to see a dark, gloomy hall typical of castles of that time. Instead, they entered a space flooded with light. Joseph Paxton, the genius of glass, accomplished an architectural revolution here. He covered the huge inner courtyard with a glass roof, creating the Grand Hall. It was a space 48 by 40 feet, where the sky was visible directly overhead, but guests were protected from rain and cold. It was not just a vestibule, it was a stage. Imagine this contrast. Ancient tapestries and armor, symbolizing the antiquity of the lineage, were illuminated not by dim candles, but by streams of daylight passing through industrial glass panels. The old met the new. Tradition met technology. The union of Hannah and Archibald breathed life into these walls that Maya could only dream of. Mentmore became the place where the fates of the cabinet were decided. Here, among palms planted right in the hall, another of Paxton's innovations that turned the house into a winter garden, prime ministers and dukes discussed colonial policy. The house worked like a flawless mechanism. But behind this facade of grandeur, a psychological rift was already beginning to form. Archibald, despite his love for Hannah, was burdened by living in a house built on his wife's money, in a house that stylistically was too loud for his refined taste. He adored the collection of books and paintings, but the architecture itself, screaming of wealth, sometimes irritated him. This was the first, barely noticeable seed of conflict. The house was created for displaying success, but its new master preferred more restrained power. Nevertheless, in the 1880s, Mentmore reached its zenith. It was a moment of perfect equilibrium, when it seemed that the Rothschilds' resources and Rosebery's influence had created an impregnable fortress. No one could have supposed that this very unique architecture, huge open spaces requiring colossal costs for heating and maintenance, would become the estate's Achilles' heel when the Golden Age gave way to an age of taxes and wars. But for now, music played in the Grand Hall, and the future seemed cloudless. To cross the threshold of Mentmore Towers in its era of bloom meant to enter the most expensive jewelry box in history. It was not just a house, but a psychological shield. Baron Mayer created a space where every square inch screamed of superiority over the old world. The heart of this universe was the Grand Hall. Imagine an atrium 48 by 40 feet, hovering in the air. Joseph Paxton's glass ceiling flooded the space with unnaturally bright light for England. Here, among live palms, the air was always warm thanks to the revolutionary heating system. It was the smell of absolute power, a thick mixture of scents from exotic flowers, polished mahogany, and century-old dust on the tapestries. The interiors were assembled from fragments of European monarchies. The walls of the dining room were adorned with genuine 18th-century gilded panels brought from the Parisian Hôtel de Villars. Guests dined literally inside the history of France. Furniture here was not bought in stores, it was rescued from revolutionary fires. Queen Marie Antoinette's personal secretaire stood here as casually as an ordinary writing desk. This was Le Goût Rothschild, the famous Rothschild style. Excess as protection from rejection. The huge marble fireplace, attributed to Rubens's design, was transported here from Antwerp. Whole tree trunks burned in it, creating primal coziness amid imperial luxury. Mirrors were placed strategically to infinitely multiply the gleam of gilded bronze and create the illusion of endless space. To service this living organism required an invisible army of 80 servants. They guarded collections of Limoges enamels and Sèvres porcelain vases, whose value exceeded the budgets of small towns. Mentmore seemed an unshakable monument. It seemed that this heavy beauty could stop time itself. But it was precisely this scale, too vast for living, too expensive for reality, that was already preparing the ground for future catastrophe. In November of 1890, the dazzling light in Mentmore's Crystal Palace went out forever. The catastrophe came not with financial ruin and not with war. It came with a quiet, invisible killer: typhoid fever. On the 19th of November, Hannah, the soul of this colossal house, and the only bridge between the Rothschilds' capital and Rosebery's ambitions, died. She was only 39 years old. For Archibald, this became not just the loss of a wife, but the collapse of the universe. Here is revealed the deepest irony of fate. It was precisely after this tragedy that he reached the peak of his career. In 1894, he fulfilled the third point of his youthful plan and became Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. But the victory turned out to be hollow. Contemporaries described him as the loneliest and most unhappy man ever to hold this post. Power without the one for whom it was won lost its meaning. Mentmore Towers transformed instantly. From a noisy political center where crystal chimed and the fates of the empire were decided, it turned into a gigantic mausoleum. Archibald issued the order that proved fatal for the estate's future: change nothing. This decision was dictated not by logic, but by despair. Hannah's rooms were sealed. Her unfinished letters remained lying on the tables, her dresses hung in the wardrobes as if she had stepped out for just a minute. The army of servants continued polishing the furniture and maintaining perfect order for a ghost. The house ceased living in the present and became stuck in the Victorian past. It was precisely at this moment that the seed of future decline was sown. While the world beyond the windows changed rapidly, cars appeared, telephones, new taxes, Mentmore was artificially held in the lethargic sleep of 1890. Archibald, locked in his grief, refused modernization. He turned the house into a shrine, not realizing that he was creating an unbearable burden for his descendants. Grandeur became a trap. The house demanded colossal resources to sustain a life that was no longer there. If the 19th century built Mentmore, and the beginning of the 20th froze it in time, then the 1970s decided to destroy it. The catastrophe that destroyed the Rothschild legacy was not a fire or a bombing. It came in the form of an official envelope with the crest of Her Majesty's Tax Service. In May of 1974, the 6th Earl of Rosebery died, the son of that very Hannah and Archibald. Along with the title, His heir, the 7th Earl Neil Primrose, received not only the keys to the great house, but also a death sentence, inheritance tax. At that time in the United Kingdom, punitive rates for wealthy landowners reached up to 75% of the property's value. The state, which Archibald had once led as Prime Minister, now demanded payment from his grandson for that grandeur. Neil Primrose faced a cruel dilemma reminiscent of an ancient Greek tragedy. To pay the tax and preserve at least the walls of the house, he had to sell what made this house alive, the collection. But he tried to accomplish the impossible. He offered the British government a deal that today seems fantastic: to buy the entire house together with the priceless collection, park and history for just £2 million sterling. This was the offer of the century. The director of the Victoria and Albert Museum, Sir Roy Strong, begged the ministers to accept it, calling Mentmore the most important collection of decorative arts remaining in private hands. For an amount equal to the cost of building a couple of kilometres of highway, the nation could have acquired its own Versailles, but the Labour government, struggling with inflation and strikes, responded with a cold refusal. They stated that the country had no money for toys of the rich. What followed was an act of cultural vandalism carried out to the sound of the auctioneer's hammer. In May of 1977, Sotheby's auction house announced the start of the sale. Mentmore Towers, which for 100 years had been a closed fortress, flung open its gates, but not to guests, but to vultures. For 10 days in that very grand hall, where kings had once dined, dealers from New York, collectors from Paris, and gawkers from London crowded. It was like a public execution. Items that Meyer Rothschild had collected across Europe to create a cohesive image of the world were torn from their context and sold piecemeal. Marie Antoinette's furniture, Rubens' fireplaces, Sèvres porcelain, Gainsborough paintings, everything went under the hammer. Journalists called it the sale of the century. The proceeds amounted to more than £6 million, 3 times more than the Earl had asked from the state. But it was a Pyrrhic victory. With each hammer strike, the soul of the house died. Here occurred a terrible transformation of meaning. Things that had been symbols of love, taste, and history turned simply into lots with numbers. The psychological integrity that Baron Mayer had so carefully built was destroyed. The house ceased to be a home. It became just a building, an enormous empty shell of stone and glass. When the last truck with antiques drove out the gates, Mentmore plunged into a silence more terrible than any graves. The walls remained, but the meaning vanished. This was the moment of truth. We understood that grandeur is material, but fragile. Without people and their memory, even the most expensive palaces turn into sets awaiting demolition. The Roseberries saved the money, but lost eternity. The house, conceived as a monument to the dynasty's immortality, became a monument to human short-sightedness and bureaucratic indifference. Today, Mentmore Towers stands in deafening silence, like a stone ship washed ashore by history. After the sale of the century, the house turned into a passing trophy. It was bought by the meditation guru Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, then by billionaire Simon Halabi, who dreamed of opening a 6-star hotel here. But all plans collapsed. The house seems to reject any new owners, remaining faithful to those who created it. Today it is listed in the Heritage at Risk register. Paxton's legendary glass roof leaks, and dampness eats away at the walls that once absorbed the brilliance of the Victorian era. The greatest irony is that millions of people have seen this house without even realizing it. Christopher Nolan chose the empty, gloomy Mentmore as Bruce Wayne's mansion in the film Batman Begins. Stanley Kubrick filmed scenes here for Eyes Wide Shut. The devastated palace became the perfect set for stories of loneliness hidden behind a mask of wealth. Cinema captured what Mentmore truly became, a beautiful but empty shell. The story of Mentmore's fall is a mirror for our time. We live in an era when efficiency is measured by numbers, not meanings. By saving £2 million in '74, the state lost a cultural asset that today would be worth hundreds of millions. But the true loss is not in money. The Rothschild's things, scattered across museums of the world, fell silent. Marie Antoinette's secrétaire in a museum is just furniture. In Mentmore, it was part of a living dialogue of eras. Baron Meyer de Rothschild built this house to prove his right to a place in history. Archibald Rosebery turned it into a temple of memory. And we allowed it to crumble, forgetting that heritage is not walls, but memory living within them. Looking at Mentmore's boarded-up windows today, we must learn a harsh lesson. Neither money, nor titles, nor genius architecture guarantee immortality. A house lives only as long as it is needed by people, not auctioneers. And sometimes the loudest sound history can make is the silence in an empty corridor where there is no one left to turn on the light.